$6.2 trillion. It used to be million, then it was billion, now it's trillion.
House approved another stimulus package totaling $3 trillion
package that will include cash payouts.
It's a $908 billion package.
Imagine currency bills becoming so worthless that thieves that steal baskets and suitcases leave the money behind on the ground because the basket is so much more valuable. A world where restaurant meals cost more when the bills come than when they were ordered, and a world where hyperinflation is so rampant that bookkeepers develop a disorder where they obsessively type out zeros on their typewriter. This sounds like something out of a dystopian movie, but were stories from the Weimar Republic, where it is said that at its worst the price of a cup of coffee would double in the time it took to drink it. Entire life savings were wiped out in a matter of days, and the cost of living went up 17 times. Zero stroke or cipher stroke was a mental disorder reportedly diagnosed by physicians during this period. The disorder was primarily characterized by the desire of patients to write endless rows of zeros. This sounds terrifying, but how does a country get in a situation where this happens in the first place? Well, before World War I, Germany was on the classical gold standard system, which meant that all of its currency in circulation had to be backed up by physical gold, making it impossible to endlessly print money. But to fund its war effort, Germany and many other industrialized nations scrapped this system, and the Imperial German government quickly acquired a 150 billion mark debt. And by the end of the war, there was 6 times more money in circulation than before the war. The Weimar economist at the time theorized this kind of devaluing was good and would help to rebuild Germany's industrial sector. After all, it would make their exports look more attractive to foreign investors, since they could simply buy German exports with their own much more valuable foreign currency. But there were many other factors driving this catastrophic inflationary cycle. As one of the losers in World War I, Germany had to pay reparation payments to its winners, primarily being France and Belgium. But wait, these payments had to be paid only in gold or in foreign currency. And since Germany had run out of gold, and because no one wanted to buy a currency that is getting printed at large amounts, Germany was forced to accept unfavorable exchange rates, needing more and more marks to buy this foreign currency. And before you know it, the 5-mark bill in 1919 had turned into a 50 trillion mark bill in 1923, and the cost of a loaf of bread went from 160 marks in 1922 to 200 trillion marks just a year later. The government and the banks either had the choice to stop the inflation and the money printing, causing immediate bankruptcies, unemployment, and the collapse of civil order, or they could continue the inflation, ultimately defaulting in their foreign debt. And by not choosing either one of these two alternatives, Germany ironically ended up with both. Now, there are even worse examples of hyperinflation out there. In 1946, Hungary saw a peak monthly inflation rate of 41.9 quadrillion %, caused by government attempts to get a war-torn economy back on its feet. World War I had a devastating effect on the country's economy, with half of its industrial capacity destroyed and the infrastructure in shambles. And with a reduction in productive capacity, the same amount of money will be running after fewer goods, sparking the beginning of hyperinflation. But instead of trying to stop this inflation by reducing the money supply and increasing interest rates, which would have crushed the economy, the government instead decided to rebuild the economy using purely printed money. They managed to restore the production, but destroyed their own currency in the process. Economists estimate that at its worst, prices would double every 15 hours, and by August of 1946, the total value of all Hungarian banknotes in circulation were valued at 1/10 of a United States penny. In 2008, Zimbabwe had reached a peak monthly inflation rate of 80 billion %, but the worrying signs started a whole decade earlier in 1998, when the government could not raise taxes anymore without causing angry protests from the people. So to keep spending at the same rate, they had to start printing more and more currency. Import prices quickly went up, causing a rise in the cost of wages and raw materials, and this higher cost of production forced companies to decrease their own production, reducing the supply of goods. And since demand had remained unchanged, consumers simply had to pay more to get these goods, causing the oh-so-familiar cycle of hyperinflation. So what do all these cases have in common? Fiscal irresponsibility, be it outright corruption, politicians giving out free stuff to get re-elected, or even well-meaning policies trying to help out and stimulate the economy, they can all end in disaster if the government keeps spending using printed money rather than taxes. Of course, nobody likes to pay taxes and everyone loves free stuff, but what people fail to realize is that hyperinflation is the biggest tax of them all, wiping out any resemblance of purchasing power for anyone who owns that currency, while at the same time enabling the government to continue their high level of spending. But there is no way the US could meet a similar fate as the Weimar Republic or Hungary, right?
I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States.
On August 15th of 1971, US President Richard Nixon announced on live television that he has ordered to temporarily suspend the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, making it possible for the US government to create dollars out of thin air in order to save the US economy from the recession. Today, 50 years later, the dollar still can't be converted, and the amount of dollars in existence went from 228 billion in 1971 to 249 billion in 1972 to 18.4 trillion dollars in 2021. Back then, the economy had also been struggling. Inflation was low, the increased money supply worked in the short term, but by the winter of 1973, the worries for hyperinflation grew stronger as the inflation more than doubled to 8.8% that year. When asked about this worry, Nixon famously said, "We will take inflation if necessary, but we cannot take unemployment." But the unemployment did not dip below 6% until 1978, and all the US dollars created during that recession caused a crippling inflation that could only be controlled with a tightened monetary policy and increased interest rates, which in turn caused what is widely considered to have been the most severe recession since World War II. Now, although inflation was rampant in the 70s in the US, with the CPI or the Consumer Price Index doubling that decade, it wasn't nearly as bad as the billions of percent of hyperinflation seen in countries like Zimbabwe and Hungary. So why are we suddenly seeing Wall Street and the markets being so worried of the US dollar crashing in 2021? To understand this, let's go to the financial crisis of 2008, where the Federal Reserve launched 4 rounds of so-called quantitative easing. This is what is more commonly referred to as money printing, and involves the Federal Reserve creating money out of thin air to do large-scale purchases of government and sometimes even corporate bonds. These purchases provide liquidity to the markets and push down interest rates on loans like mortgages or corporate loans, and in the end make it cheaper for households and businesses to borrow money, and through that encouraging spending and stimulating the economy. Naturally, these policies increase money supply or the amount of money in circulation, which can in turn lead to inflation. Between 2008 and 2014, the Federal Reserve balance sheet rose from less than $1 trillion to 4.4 trillion, all created out of nothing. There were definitely inflation worries back then as well, but through tightening policies and an increase in interest rates, these worries soon faded away until the 2020 pandemic and its devastating economic consequences. Apart from hundreds of thousands of lives being lost, the lockdowns that ensued caused the markets to crash and unemployment to skyrocket. On March 23, 2020, Chair of the Federal Reserve Jerome Powell announced QE infinity, basically as much money printing as necessary to stimulate and save the economy. What followed was rescue package after rescue package, and the government spending reached new heights in an effort to help corporations and households survive during these unique times. The day of this announcement, the Dow Jones Index rallied a staggering 10%, and we have been on a clear uptrend since. The balance sheet quickly grew during these times, and the 4.4 trillion that was reached in 2014 as a result of the financial crisis is today almost $8 trillion. The money supply, or the total amount of money in circulation, has gone up tremendously, with around 25% of all dollars in existence being printed back in 2020.
Fair to say you simply flooded the system with money?
Yes, we did. That's another way to think about it. We did.
Where does it come from? Do you just print it?
We print it digitally. So we as a central bank, we have the ability to create money.
Knowing this, you can't help but draw parallels to all the previously mentioned hyperinflation disasters, where there is always some kind of larger event shocking the economy and causing a downturn. This time it was a pandemic, and it is especially tricky since some amount of government is necessary in times like this. But it is so important to remember that some amount of recession is also healthy and a natural part of the economic cycle. In fact, those times usually mark the start of massive bull rallies for the stock market and economic prosperity in general. But instead, seeing everything going to new all-time highs and trillions of dollars being printed is worrying. So we have seen an unprecedented increase in money supply, trillions of dollars worth of stimulus going out to corporations, households and the public sector, and the government is operating on larger and larger deficits, all while economic growth is struggling due to the pandemic. So where is the hyperinflation? Well, for one, many argue there actually is inflation going on right now, but that it is conveniently hidden and not used in the various calculations. After all, the markets, corporations and the people love to hear that the money printer won't be slowing down anytime soon and that all the various benefits will continue without consequences. And looking at the stock market or the commodity market, prices have indeed been going up quite a lot. Lumber has famously seen a spike of around 300% since March of 2020. Copper prices are seeing their highest levels since 2011, and precious metals like gold, silver and platinum are all on long-term uptrends. And not to mention, the S&P 500, the Nasdaq and the Dow Jones Index have all skyrocketed at rates never seen in the history of the stock market. And of course, no one is complaining. They're making money, and as long as the markets keep going up, everyone will be happy. No, the biggest worry right now is the inflation in consumer prices, which will reveal itself as soon as the uncertainty and the fear of losing your job goes away and the lockdowns start to ease. According to the age-old quantitative money theory, this is known as money velocity, or how fast money changes hands. Doesn't matter how much the money supply or the money printing increases, if the velocity goes down, we still won't see higher prices. But when the velocity goes back up, the only question is how much inflation will we actually see? And looking at the record increase in money supply and the Federal Reserve balance sheet, it would not be too out of reach to assume that we are entering a hyperinflationary spiral like Zimbabwe, the Weimar Republic, Hungary, Yugoslavia, Venezuela, and many more. Right? That would indeed make sense if USA was a country like any other, but in actuality the United States dollar is considered the world reserve currency, and it is held by every country in the world. The US Treasury bond is seen as the single most risk-free asset because of the power the entire world has ascribed to this country. Today, more than 61% of all foreign bank reserves are denominated in the US dollar, mostly being cash or US bonds like US Treasuries, and approximately 40% of the world's debt is denominated in the dollar. The reserve status is based largely on the size and strength of the US economy, the dominance of the US financial markets, and despite large deficit spending, trillions of dollars in debt, and the unbridled, infinite, constant printing of US dollars, the American Treasury securities remain the safest store of money. The trust and confidence that the world has in the ability of the United States to pay its debts have kept the dollar as the most redeemable currency for world trade. And as long as this trust remains, the Federal Reserve can keep printing as much as it wants. Also, it's not like the United States is alone in this money printing. Pretty much every country has been doing it to some extent. So, will the US be able to get out of the pandemic recession through money printing and endless stimulus, ultimately tightening monetary policy and seeing a recovery to pre-pandemic levels? Or are we about to see the biggest economic experiment of our lifetimes fail miserably, wiping out purchasing power and causing horrific hyperinflation? In all honesty, only time will tell. The late famous investor and fund manager John Templeton once said, "The four most dangerous words in investing are, this time is different." And I am personally willing to at least account for this inflation risk in my own investments by 1. Trying to avoid holding US dollars or US bonds, 2. Making sure to own a small percentage in commodities and inflation hedges like gold, silver and cryptocurrencies, and 3. Owning some stocks that at least partly operate outside of the United States and that earn other currencies than the US dollar. Historically, even US stocks have proven to be able to keep up up with inflation quite well, and of course I want to enjoy this current market rally, so no selling will be taking place. Of course, not financial advice, make sure to do your own research and come to your own conclusions with your hard-earned money. And friends, that concludes today's video. Thank you for watching, and consider subscribing and press the notification bell if you want to be updated on my next videos. Bye.